I've been working in the morgue for years now, and I've seen my fair share of strange things, but nothing prepared me for that night. It was just another quiet evening at the morgue in Sydney, the kind where you can almost hear your own heartbeat echo in the silence. I had just finished my coffee when the phone rang, notifying me of a new arrival, a woman in her late 70s who had passed away suddenly. The paramedics who brought her in were tight-lipped, but I could see the unease in their eyes. As they wheeled her in, I caught a glimpse of her face, and a chill ran down my spine. Her expression was frozen in a look of sheer terror, her eyes wide open as if she had seen something unspeakable in her final moments. After the paramedics left, I approached the body, trying to shake off the discomfort that had settled in my gut. The woman's skin was pale and cold, but there were no visible signs of trauma, no bruises, no cuts, nothing that would explain the fear etched into her features. I told myself it was just another case, that I'd seen worse, but something about this one felt different, like there was a presence lingering in the room that I couldn't quite put my finger on. As I began the process of preparing her for autopsy, I couldn't shake the feeling that she was watching me, even though I knew it was impossible. I remember carefully removing the sheet that covered her, revealing her frail, lifeless body. Her hands were clenched into tight fists, and I had to gently pry them open to place them by her sides. As I did, I noticed something odd. Her fingernails were clean and well manicured, not at all what I expected for someone who had passed so suddenly. It was as if she had been preparing for something, maybe even expecting it. The thought sent another shiver down my spine, and I quickly dismissed it, trying to focus on the task at hand. But the unease was growing, a heavy weight pressing down on my chest. With the body now fully exposed, I began the initial examination, checking for any signs of foul play. Her body was thin, almost emaciated, with deep wrinkles carving lines into her face and hands. Yet, there was something about those wrinkles that seemed unnatural. They were too deep, too sharp, almost as if they had been etched into her skin rather than forming naturally with age. And her eyes, those wide, glassy eyes, seemed to follow me as I moved around the room, a silent witness to the events unfolding. I found myself glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone standing there, but the room was empty, save for the two of us. As I continued with the examination, the atmosphere in the room grew colder, almost unbearably so. I could see my breath in the air, a thin mist forming with every exhale. The lights flickered once, twice, and then steadied, casting long shadows across the room. I felt a sudden urge to leave, to get out of that room and never look back, but I couldn't. I had a job to do, and I wasn't about to let some irrational fear get the better of me. Still, the sense of dread was overwhelming, and I couldn't help but wonder if I was being watched not just by the woman on the table, but by something unseen lurking in the corners of the room. Finally, I reached a point where I had to prepare the body for the night. I gently covered her with a fresh sheet, though I couldn't shake the feeling that she was still staring at me, even with her eyes closed. I stepped back, taking one last look at her before turning off the lights. As I did, I thought I heard a faint sound, a whisper, maybe, or the rustle of fabric, but when I turned back, the room was silent. I stood there for a moment, frozen in place, my heart pounding in my chest. Something was very wrong here, but I didn't know what. All I knew was that the night was far from over, and whatever was coming next, I wasn't ready for it. As the hours ticked by, the uneasy feeling from earlier refused to leave me. I tried to distract myself with paperwork, but my mind kept drifting back to that woman lying in the cold, sterile room down the hall. It was almost midnight when I decided to check on her one last time before clocking out. The morgue was quiet, the kind of silence that makes your ears ring, and as I pushed open the door, I was immediately hit by a wave of cold air that made my skin prickle. I glanced around the room, half expecting to see something out of place, but everything was just as I'd left it except for her. I walked over to the table, trying to ignore the icy grip of fear that had settled in my stomach. As I pulled back the sheet, my breath caught in my throat. The woman's face, it had changed. The deep lines that had been so prominent just hours before were now barely visible, her skin smoother, almost youthful. I blinked, thinking my eyes were playing tricks on me, but when I looked again, it was undeniable. Her silver hair, which had been dull and brittle, was now darker, with a slight sheen as if life had been restored to it. My heart pounded in my chest, a rhythm of panic that echoed in my ears. I stood there, staring at her, unable to comprehend what I was seeing. This kind of thing just didn't happen, not here, not anywhere. Bodies didn't just change like that. I reached out, hesitating for a moment before touching her hand, which had once been cold and stiff. To my horror, it felt warm, almost as if there was still life flowing through it. I pulled my hand back quickly, my mind racing. This was impossible. It had to be. I was imagining things. That was the only explanation. But as I backed away from the table, I heard a low, mournful sobbing that seemed to fill the room. I froze, the sound sending a chill down my spine. It was coming from the woman, from the very place where she lay. My eyes darted around the room, searching for the source of the noise, but there was nothing, no one. The sobbing grew louder, more desperate, and I could feel the hair on the back of my neck stand on end. I wanted to run, to get out of that room and never come back, but something kept me rooted to the spot. I had to know, had to see what was happening to her. Against every instinct screaming at me to leave, I leaned in closer. As I moved nearer, the sobbing softened, turning into a soft, almost soothing murmur. My heart was racing, my hands trembling as I reached out once more. Her skin was now smooth, almost flawless, with a warmth that defied the chill in the room. My mind was a whirlwind of confusion and fear, but I couldn't tear my eyes away from her. Then, suddenly, her eyes snapped open. I gasped, stumbling backward as her gaze locked onto mine. There was something deeply unsettling in those eyes, something that shouldn't have been their life. But not the kind of life I'd ever seen before. Her lips curled into a slow, deliberate smile, and that's when I heard a whisper, soft but clear, that sent ice through my veins. "This is not the end." The words hung in the air, heavy and ominous, as if they carried some dark promise. My breath caught in my throat, and I could feel my heart pounding against my ribs, each beat louder than the last. I wanted to scream, to do something, anything, but I was paralyzed by fear. She shouldn't be alive. She couldn't be. And yet, here she was, smiling at me with a twisted, knowing look that made my blood run cold. I took a shaky step back, my mind screaming at me to get out, to run as fast as I could. But before I could move, the lights flickered, casting the room in a series of eerie shadows. When they steadied, she was still there, her gaze fixed on me, that smile still playing on her lips. I felt a wave of nausea wash over me, and the room seemed to spin. I had to get out, now. I turned on my heel, almost tripping over my own feet as I rushed for the door. But even as I fled, I could still hear it. That soft, taunting whisper echoing in my mind. This is not the end. I stumbled out of the room, my heart pounding like a drum in my chest. My mind was reeling, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Every logical part of me screamed that it wasn't possible, that what I'd seen couldn't be real, but deep down, I knew there was no denying it. The memory of her smile, that twisted, unnatural grin, was burned into my mind. And those words, "This is not the end," echoed over and over, a chilling mantra that seemed to fill the empty halls of the morgue. I leaned against the wall, trying to catch my breath, but the fear was suffocating, wrapping itself around me like a vice. For a moment, I considered calling for help, but what could I say? That a corpse had come back to life? That she'd spoken to me, whispered something that made my blood run cold? No one would believe me, and even if they did, what could they do? I was alone in this, left to face whatever was happening. The thought made my stomach churn, and I could feel the bile rising in my throat. I knew I had to go back in there, to make sure I wasn't losing my mind, but every fiber of my being resisted. What if she was still there, waiting for me with that horrible smile? I pushed the door open slowly, half expecting her to be standing right in front of me, but the room was empty. The lights had stopped flickering, and the cold air that had filled the room earlier had dissipated, leaving behind an eerie stillness. I forced myself to step inside, my eyes immediately darting to the table where she'd been lying. The sheet was undisturbed, covering the body just as I'd left it, or so I thought. My hands were trembling as I reached for the edge of the sheet, bracing myself for what I might find. I hesitated, my heart in my throat, and then, with a deep breath, I pulled it back. The table was empty, the body was gone. I stared in disbelief, my mind refusing to accept what my eyes were seeing. How could this be happening? How could she just vanish? I looked around the room, searching for any sign of her, but there was nothing, no trace that she'd ever been there at all. Panic surged through me, and I felt the walls closing in. I was trapped in a nightmare, and there was no waking up from this. I backed away from the table, my breath coming in short, shallow gasps, and then I noticed it on the floor, where her body had been, a single gray hair. I bent down, picking up the hair with trembling fingers. It was unmistakable, the same shade of gray that her hair had been when she first arrived. But that wasn't possible. She had been lying there just moments ago, hadn't she? I couldn't trust my own senses anymore, couldn't tell what was real and what wasn't. My thoughts were spiraling, a chaotic mess of fear and confusion, and all the while, her words kept replaying in my mind. This is not the end. What did she mean? What was coming next? I didn't want to know, but I couldn't escape the feeling that whatever it wasn't over. I dropped the hair, wiping my hands on my scrubs as if I could rid myself of the taint of this night. But the fear clung to me, a heavy, oppressive presence that I couldn't shake. I knew I couldn't stay there, couldn't face whatever horror was waiting in the shadows. I needed to get out, to put as much distance between me and that room as possible. But as I turned to leave, I heard it again, a faint, almost imperceptible whisper, like a breath against my ear. This is not the end. My blood ran cold, and I bolted for the door, not daring to look back. The hallway outside was deserted, the fluorescent lights casting harsh shadows on the linoleum floor. I raced down the corridor, my footsteps echoing in the emptiness, but no matter how fast I ran, I couldn't escape the feeling that I was being watched, that something was following me. I burst through the exit, the cool night air hitting me like a slap in the face. I didn't stop running until I reached my car, fumbling with the keys, my hands shaking so badly I could barely get the door open. I slammed it shut behind me, locking the doors with a trembling hand, and only then did I allow myself to breathe. But even as I sat there, gasping for air, I knew I wouldn't be able to drive away, to leave it all behind. Because she was right, this wasn't the end. Whatever had happened in that morgue, it wasn't over. It would never be over. I could feel it, a dark presence that had latched onto me, that would haunt me for the rest of my days. I stared out the windshield, my mind racing, trying to figure out what to do next, but deep down, I knew there was no escaping this. No matter where I went, no matter how far I ran, she would always be there, waiting, watching, whispering those terrible words. This is not the end.
My name's David M. Lur, and I've spent more years than I care to count as a forensic pathologist here in Berlin. You might think I'm used to seeing death in all its forms, but nothing could have prepared me for what happened that cold, rainy night. The body arrived late, as they often do, a middle-aged man who, at first glance, seemed to have died of natural causes. No signs of struggle. No visible wounds, just a lifeless form on a metal gurney. But what caught my eye immediately was the ring, an eerie, skull-shaped piece of jewelry on his finger, so intricately crafted it almost seemed alive. I've seen plenty of rings in my line of work, but this one sent a shiver down my spine. As I moved closer to the body, the feeling of unease only grew stronger. There was something about that ring that made my skin crawl, though I couldn't quite put my finger on it. It was just a piece of metal, right? But as I prepped for the autopsy, I couldn't shake the feeling that the corpse was watching me, almost as if it was aware of my every move. Silly, I know. It was just exhaustion, I told myself. Long hours and too many late nights in the morgue can do that to you. But the longer I stared at that skull, the more it felt like the empty eye sockets were boring into my soul, and I began to question whether I should proceed. Still, I pushed forward. I had a job to do, after all, and I wasn't about to let some irrational fear get the best of me. But as I reached out to begin the examination, my hand hesitated, hovering over the ring. It was as if an invisible force was holding me back, whispering in my ear that this was a mistake. I took a deep breath, trying to steady my nerves, and reminded myself that this was just another case. Another corpse, another ring, nothing more. But that gnawing sense of dread refused to let go, gripping me tighter with each passing second. I've never been one to believe in the supernatural, but there was something undeniably unsettling about this situation. The room felt colder, the shadows seemed to stretch further, and the quiet hum of the fluorescent lights overhead grew louder, almost deafening. I tried to shake off the feeling, but it clung to me like a wet blanket, heavy and suffocating. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to leave, to get out of there, but I couldn't. Duty called, and I was nothing if not dedicated to my work. But in the back of my mind, a small voice whispered that maybe, just maybe, I was in over my head. I decided to take a moment, step back, and clear my mind. Maybe it was just the long hours catching up to me, or perhaps the unsettling atmosphere of the morgue was playing tricks on my mind. I rubbed my temples, trying to shake off the fog of fatigue, but the unease remained, stubborn and relentless. As I stood there, staring at the lifeless body on the table, a thought crossed my mind that I couldn't ignore. What if this ring was more than just a piece of jewelry? What if it carried with it something dark, something malevolent? I laughed at myself for even considering such nonsense, but the feeling of dread only deepened. Finally, I forced myself to focus, determined to get through the autopsy without any more distractions. I gathered my tools, preparing to do what I'd done countless times before. But as I reached for the scalpel, I couldn't help but glance at the ring one last time. It seemed to glint under the harsh fluorescent light, as if mocking me, daring me to uncover its secrets. I shook my head, chiding myself for letting my imagination run wild. This was just another body, and I was just doing my job. But deep down, I knew that this night would be different, that this autopsy would leave a mark on me that I'd never forget. With a final deep breath, I stepped forward, ready to begin. But as my gloved hand hovered over the ring, that sense of foreboding returned, stronger than ever. Something about this situation felt wrong, terribly wrong. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was standing on the edge of something dark and dangerous, something I wasn't prepared to face. But there was no turning back now. The autopsy had to be done, and I was the one who had to do it. Little did I know, the nightmare was only just beginning, and that cursed ring was about to pull me into a darkness I never imagined. The moment my hand made contact with the skull ring, I knew I'd made a grave mistake. The cold metal felt like ice against my skin, and then, without warning, my fingers began to tremble uncontrollably. I'd never experienced anything like it before. My hands, usually so steady and precise, were now betraying me. My instruments slipped from my grasp, clattering to the floor in a chaotic symphony. Panic surged through me as I stared at my trembling hands, powerless to make them stop. It was as if the ring itself was rejecting my touch, pushing me away with an unseen force that I couldn't comprehend. I tried to steady myself, taking deep breaths to calm the rising tide of fear, but the harder I tried to regain control, the more intense the tremors became. My heart raced, pounding in my chest like a drum, as I struggled to understand what was happening. I'd heard of bizarre things happening in the morgue before, unexplained noises, strange occurrences, but I'd always chalked them up to overactive imaginations. Now, though, I wasn't so sure. This was real. My hands were shaking, my tools were scattered across the floor, and the skull ring. It seemed to be the source of it all. In a desperate attempt to break free from whatever was happening, I let go of the ring. Instantly, the tremors ceased, and my hands were once again steady. I stood there, gasping for breath, my mind racing to make sense of what I just experienced. The ring lay on the table, innocent in appearance, but I knew better. There was something wrong with it, something I couldn't explain. I wanted to leave, to get as far away from that cursed object as possible, but my curiosity kept me rooted to the spot. What was it about this ring that had such a powerful effect on me? That night, as I tried to sleep, the memories of the day's events replayed in my mind like a broken record. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the ring, felt the tremors, heard the clatter of my tools hitting the floor. And then the nightmares began. In my dreams, the corpse I'd examined rose from the autopsy table, its eyes fixated on me, the skull ring clutched tightly in its hand. The man's voice, low and guttural, whispered words that sent chills down my spine. The cycle never ends. I woke up in a cold sweat, my heart racing, the words echoing in my mind like a dark omen. I tried to convince myself it was just a dream, just my imagination playing tricks on me after a long and stressful day. But the fear clung to me, gnawing at the edges of my sanity. Every time I looked at my hand, I half expected to see the ring there, mocking me. And then, one morning, my worst fear became reality. I woke up, groggy and disoriented, and as I rubbed my eyes, I felt something cold against my skin. I looked down, and there it was, the skull ring, now firmly seated on my finger. It was as if it had never left, as if it had always belonged to me. My first instinct was to rip the ring off, to throw it as far away from me as possible. But the moment I tried, the tremors returned, more violent than before. My fingers seized up, refusing to obey my commands, and the pain shot through my hand like fire. I let go, and the pain subsided, but the ring remained. It was as if it had fused with my skin, becoming a part of me. I stared at it, horrified, realizing that whatever curse this ring carried, it had now claimed me as its own. I was trapped, bound to this cursed object, with no idea how to free myself. As the days passed, the nightmares grew worse, more vivid, more real. The corpse haunted my every waking moment, standing in the shadows of my room, always watching, always whispering those same terrifying words, "The cycle never ends." I knew then that this was no ordinary ring, and that I was in the grip of something far beyond my understanding. The more I fought it, the tighter its hold became. And as the ring's influence spread, I began to fear that I was losing more than just my sanity. I was losing myself. The man I once was, the life I once had, were slipping away, and there was nothing I could do to stop it. The morning after that terrifying discovery, I knew my life would never be the same. The skull ring clung to my finger like a shackle, and no matter how hard I tried, it refused to budge. Every attempt to remove it triggered those violent tremors, a cruel reminder that this cursed object had claimed me. I was trapped, and as the hours passed, the reality of my situation began to sink in. The ring wasn't just a piece of jewelry, it was a curse, one that had ensnared me in its grip, pulling me deeper into a nightmare from which there was no escape. I tried to keep up appearances at work, but it didn't take long for my colleagues to notice something was off. I was distracted, jumpy, and my hands, once steady as a rock, now trembled with a nervous energy I couldn't control. They asked if I was okay, if I needed a break, but how could I explain what was happening? How could I tell them about the ring, the nightmares, the corpse that haunted me day and night? I couldn't. So I lied, telling them it was just stress, that I'd been working too hard. But deep down, I knew the truth. This was no ordinary stress. This was something far darker, something I couldn't outrun. The corpse from my nightmare started to appear in my waking moments, a shadowy figure lurking in the corners of my vision, always watching, always whispering those same haunting words, "The cycle never ends." It was as if the line between my dreams and reality had blurred, leaving me in a constant state of dread. Every creak, every rustle of fabric sent my heart racing, as I expected to see that ghastly figure standing there, the skull ring gleaming on its finger. The fear was suffocating, wrapping around me like a vice, tightening with every passing moment. Desperation drove me to seek help, though I had no idea where to turn. Doctors, priests, even the occasional occultist, all of them looked at me with a mix of pity and disbelief. They couldn't understand what I was going through, and why would they? To them, I was just another man losing his grip on reality. But I knew better. I knew that this wasn't just in my head. The ring was real, the curse was real, and it was consuming me from the inside out. Every day, I felt myself slipping further away, losing pieces of myself to the darkness that had taken root in my soul. It wasn't long before I realized that no one could help me. I was on my own, fighting a battle I couldn't hope to win. The ring had become a part of me, a constant presence that I couldn't escape. Even when I wasn't looking at it, I could feel it cold, heavy, and unyielding, like a chain binding me to something ancient and malevolent. The whispers grew louder, the shadows darker, and the fear became unbearable. I could feel it gnawing at my sanity, eroding the walls I'd built around my mind, until there was nothing left but the overwhelming sense of doom. One night, as I lay in bed, unable to sleep, I felt the full weight of the curse settle over me. The whispers were deafening, the shadows alive with malevolent intent. I knew then that the ring wasn't just a curse, it was a prison, one that I would never escape. The cycle had begun, and I was its latest victim. I could feel the darkness closing in, the ring tightening its grip on my soul, and I knew that my time was running out. There was no escape, no salvation, only the cold, unrelenting truth. I was doomed to suffer, just like the man before me and the man before him. The cycle never ends. And so, with trembling hands, I made my final entry, scrawling these words in a desperate attempt to leave behind some record of my torment. But even as I wrote, I could feel the last vestiges of my sanity slipping away, leaving me with nothing but the ring and the curse it carried. My story ends here, but the cycle will continue long after I'm gone.
You know, there are days when you feel like you've seen it all, working in a place like this. I've been an assistant at the Paris Morgue for a few years now, and I've handled more bodies than I care to count. But nothing could have prepared me for what happened that night. It was late, almost closing time, when they brought him in. A man, maybe in his 40s, found dead in the Seine. The report said he drowned, which seemed straightforward enough. But the moment I laid eyes on him, something didn't sit right. His skin was dry, completely dry, and there wasn't a hint of water on him. It was like he hadn't touched a river at all. I remember standing there, staring at his body, trying to make sense of it. I mean, a drowning victim should have water in the lungs, right? There should be bloating, signs of immersion, but there was nothing. It was as if the river had rejected him. His eyes were closed, and his face had this strange calm about it, but it wasn't peaceful in a comforting way. It was eerie and settling, and those eyes, when I opened them during the examination, there was this look, like he was pleading with me, silently begging for something. I felt a chill run down my spine, but I shook it off, telling myself it was just another long night at work. As I went through the routine, I couldn't stop thinking about that look. His eyes kept haunting me, even when I wasn't looking at him. I've seen plenty of bodies with their fair share of tragic stories, but this one felt different. It was like there was something more, something just beneath the surface that I couldn't quite grasp. The more I examined him, the more questions I had. Why was he dry? Why did he look so calm, yet so desperate? And why did I feel like he was trying to tell me something? I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't just another routine case. You know that nagging sensation you get when you're sure you've forgotten something important, but you can't remember what it is? That's what I felt as I finished up the paperwork. I kept glancing over at the slab where he lay, half expecting him to sit up and start talking. Of course, that's ridiculous, he was dead, after all, but the feeling wouldn't go away. It's like the air in the room was thicker, heavier, pressing down on me, making it hard to breathe. I've never been one to believe in ghosts or the supernatural, but that night made me wonder. I finished my work as quickly as I could, trying to push the unease to the back of my mind. But every time I turned my back on the body, I felt like something was watching me. It was irrational. I knew that, but the feeling was so strong, I couldn't ignore it. I even checked the security cameras just to reassure myself that everything was normal. But that only made things worse. The cameras showed nothing out of the ordinary, just me, the room, and the body. But there was something about the way the shadows fell across the slab, something that made my skin crawl. I tried to laugh it off, chalking it up to an overactive imagination, but deep down, I knew there was more to it. As I finally left the morgue that night, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was leaving something unfinished. The streets of Paris were quiet, almost too quiet, as I made my way home. I kept replaying the night in my head, trying to make sense of it all, but there were no answers, only more questions. And that look, the one in his eyes, it followed me all the way home, into my dreams, and even into the next day. I told myself it was just another day at the morgue, but deep down, I knew that wasn't true. Something had started that night, something I couldn't explain, and I had a feeling it wasn't over yet. I decided to stay late that night, thinking I could catch up on some paperwork and maybe put my mind at ease about what had happened earlier. The morgue was quiet, almost too quiet, with only the hum of the fluorescent lights and the occasional creak of the old building to keep me company. But as the hours ticked by, I started to notice something strange. At first, it was just a small puddle of water on the floor near the slab where the drowned man's body lay. I figured it was a leak, maybe from a pipe or something, but when I checked, everything was dry. The water wasn't coming from the ceiling or the walls. It was coming from the body. It didn't make any sense. I had examined him thoroughly, and there was no sign of water anywhere on or in him. But now, here it was, seeping out from under the sheet that covered him. I wiped it up, trying to ignore the uneasy feeling creeping up my spine, but the water kept coming. No matter how many times I cleaned it up, it reappeared, slowly spreading across the floor. And then, as the clock struck midnight, I heard it. At first, it was just a faint sound, almost like the rustling of leaves, but as I listened closer, I realized it was more like a gurgling, choking noise, as if someone were struggling to breathe. My heart started pounding in my chest as I strained to hear where the sound was coming from. It was so faint, I could barely make it out, but it seemed to be coming from the direction of the body. I told myself it was just my imagination, that it was just the old pipes making noise, but the sound grew louder, more insistent. And then, I heard it clear as day, a voice, low and desperate, whispering in French, "Aidez-moi, s'il vous plaît, help me, please." My blood ran cold as I realized the voice was coming from the body. The body that I knew was dead. I wanted to run, to get out of that morgue as fast as I could, but I was frozen in place, unable to move. The room grew colder, and the puddles of water began to spread, inching closer and closer to where I stood. I tried to tell myself it wasn't real, that I was just imagining things, but the voice kept whispering, pleading, and the water kept rising. It was like the room itself was alive, breathing, waiting for something to happen. My mind was racing, trying to find a logical explanation, but there was none. I was alone in that morgue with a dead man who was somehow calling out to me. As the water reached my feet, I felt a chill seep into my bones, a cold so deep it felt like it was coming from inside me. The voice had stopped, but the silence was even worse. It was heavy, oppressive, like the air had been sucked out of the room. I could feel something watching me, something just out of sight, lurking in the shadows. Every instinct told me to run, to get out, but I couldn't leave him. It was like I was tethered to that spot, unable to move, unable to breathe. I kept staring at the body, waiting for something to happen, knowing that whatever it was, it wouldn't be good. The minutes dragged on like hours, each one more unbearable than the last. The water was up to my ankles now, cold and slimy, like the river itself had invaded the room. I was shaking, partly from the cold and partly from fear, but I couldn't tear my eyes away from the slab. I kept expecting him to move, to sit up, to say something, but he didn't. The only sound was the dripping of water, echoing in the silence. I was trapped in a nightmare, one that I couldn't wake up from. And the worst part was, I knew this was just the beginning. By the time the first light of dawn crept into the morgue, I was a wreck. I had spent the entire night huddled in a corner, too terrified to move, too exhausted to think clearly. The water had receded, leaving the floor damp and slick, but the cold still clung to the air like a heavy fog. I could barely keep my eyes open, but something compelled me to get up, to go back to the slab and look at the body one more time. I didn't want to, but I knew I had to. There was no escaping it. The moment I stood up, I knew something had changed. The room was still, almost eerily calm, but as I approached the body, my heart sank. The man who had been so dry, so pristine just hours before, was now covered in thick green algae. It coated his skin, his hair, his clothes like he had been submerged in water for years. Seaweed tangled around his limbs, wrapping around his wrists and ankles like chains. His eyes, which had once been closed, were now wide open, staring blankly at the ceiling, his face contorted in a look of pure agony. It was like he had lived through something unspeakable after death. The smell hit me next. It wasn't just a stench of decay. It was something else, something worse. It was the smell of salt water, of rot, of things that had been dead for far too long. I gagged, covering my mouth, but I couldn't tear my eyes away from him. The water might have vanished, but the evidence of its presence was all over him. It was like he had been dragged back from the depths of the Seine, not just as a corpse, but as something other. I don't know how long I stood there, staring, but every second felt like an eternity. I thought about running, about getting out of that morgue and never looking back, but something held me there. Maybe it was the same force that had kept me rooted in place all night, or maybe it was the curiosity that had gotten the better of me. Either way, I knew I couldn't leave without understanding what had happened. The seaweed, the algae, the look in his eyes, it all told a story that I was afraid to hear but couldn't ignore. And that's when I felt it. A breeze, cold and damp, like the breath of the ocean, sweeping through the room. It carried with it a sound, faint at first but growing louder like the distant crash of waves on a shore. But we were miles from the coast, and there was no water here. The breeze grew stronger, swirling around me, lifting strands of seaweed from the body and sending them spiraling through the air. I stumbled back, panic rising in my chest, but the wind didn't stop. It howled through the morgue, carrying with it the unmistakable scent of salt and decay, and that's when I knew. This wasn't just about a body, about a man who had drowned in the Seine. This was something far older, far darker. My mind raced, trying to make sense of it all, but the more I thought, the less it made sense. The body, the water, the voice, it was all connected, part of something much bigger, something I couldn't explain. I felt like I was on the edge of understanding, just one step away from figuring it all out, but the answer stayed just out of reach. All I knew for sure was that whatever had happened to this man, whatever had claimed him, hadn't let go. It was still here, still lurking in the shadows, waiting. And I had the terrible feeling that it was watching me too. I backed away slowly, my heart pounding in my chest, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed. The air was thick with tension, the kind that makes your skin crawl and your hair stand on end. I glanced over my shoulder, half expecting to see something moving in the corner of my eye, but there was nothing. Just the empty morgue, the body on the slab, and the oppressive silence. But I knew better. Something was here with me, something I couldn't see, and it wasn't going to let me leave so easily.